She was just refueling aircraft at Denver International's private terminal. No pilot's license visible, no flight suit, no recognition from the crew chiefs who barely acknowledged her existence. But when the lead test pilot couldn't stabilize the prototype without its primary flight controls and declared the aircraft unflyable, she spoke up. One observation, quiet but precise, and before anyone could process what was happening, she was climbing into the cockpit of a $50 million experimental aircraft. No autopilot, no flight management system, no margin for error. What happened next changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The other pilots stepped back and watched as the maintenance crew member they'd ignored for 18 months prepared to attempt what their most experienced aviator had just declared impossible. But before we reveal how Jonah Mitchell stunned a team of elite test pilots with her flying, let's understand exactly how she ended up in that cockpit. Jonah Mitchell had mastered the art of being overlooked. In the world of experimental aviation at Rockwell Aerospace's Flight Test Division, staying invisible was survival. Show up before dawn, fuel the aircraft, run the pre-flight checks, keep your observations to yourself, and let the pilots pretend you didn't exist while they discussed flight characteristics and performance parameters you understood better than most of them did. It had worked for 18 months at the secluded test facility outside Denver, where prototype aircraft pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible. Most days, she preferred the anonymity. Being noticed in this environment usually meant being questioned about qualifications she technically didn't possess, certifications she'd never pursued, and credentials that existed only in the memories of a man who could no longer advocate for her abilities. That particular Wednesday morning began exactly like the 547 that had preceded it. Jonah's weathered Ford pickup rumbled through the security checkpoint at 4:47 a.m., 13 minutes before the facility officially opened. She parked in the furthest spot from the hangar offices, away from the spaces reserved for project engineers and test pilots, and gathered her toolkit from behind the driver's seat. The pre-dawn air carried the distinctive smell of jet fuel and high-octane aviation gasoline that had become as familiar as her morning coffee. The work wasn't prestigious, but it paid $18.50 an hour and allowed her to work around her evening classes at Metro State University's Aerospace Engineering program. With her mother's cancer treatments consuming most of their savings and her father's veteran's disability barely covering basic expenses, every dollar mattered more than pride. She calculated constantly. 32 hours a week at Rockwell, weekend shifts at the FBO handling corporate jets, plus her part-time work tutoring physics students. If she maintained this schedule for another 28 months, she could finish her engineering degree without accumulating additional student debt. The mathematics of survival had become as precise as navigation calculations. Hangar 7 housed the morning's priority, the X-47 Delta, an experimental fly-by-wire aircraft designed to test advanced flight control systems, had experienced hydraulic anomalies during yesterday's test flight. 2 of the 3 primary control computers had malfunctioned, leaving the aircraft dependent on mechanical backup systems that most modern pilots had never actually used in flight conditions. Jonah approached the sleek aircraft with the methodical precision that had defined her work since childhood. Her father, Colonel David Mitchell, had instilled in her that careless preparation killed aviators, and 18 months of observing test flights had shown her exactly how many variables could transform routine procedures into life-threatening emergencies. The X-47's fuel system required particular attention. Unlike conventional aircraft, the experimental design used a complex network of pumps and valves to maintain proper weight distribution as fuel was consumed. A single miscalibrated sensor could create handling characteristics that would challenge even experienced pilots. Jonah knew this because she'd observed the phenomenon during 3 previous test flights, noting correlations between fuel flow patterns and control surface effectiveness that the pilots had attributed to other factors. She was checking the starboard wing fuel lines when she heard the distinctive sound of high-performance vehicles approaching. Not the usual government sedans or contractor pickup trucks, but the low rumble of modified sports cars that announced the arrival of people who commanded attention wherever they went. The test pilots emerged from their vehicles like characters from a recruitment poster. Captain Sarah Brooks, formerly of the Air Force Test Pilot School, moved with the confident efficiency of someone who'd flown everything from experimental fighters to space shuttle approaches. Her reputation preceded her into every conversation, and her flight suit bore patches from programs that most aviators only read about in trade publications. Major Jackson Turner represented the Navy's contribution to the Joint Test Program. His background included carrier operations, weapons testing, and a classified period flying aircraft that officially didn't exist. He possessed the particular brand of competence that came from landing jets on moving ships in weather that grounded everyone else. Dr. Asa Elena Rodriguez held civilian credentials that impressed even military aviators. Former NASA test pilot, aerospace engineering doctorate from MIT, and author of papers on advanced flight control systems that had redefined industry standards. She approached flying with the methodical precision of someone who understood both the theoretical principles and practical limitations of experimental aircraft. The newest member of their group, Lieutenant Marcus Chen, carried himself with the eager intensity of someone still proving he belonged among legends. Fresh from the Air Force Test Pilot School's most recent graduating class, he possessed textbook knowledge of advanced systems but limited experience with the kind of edge case scenarios that defined experimental flight testing. Chen noticed Jonah working on the fuel system and offered what he probably considered a friendly observation. "Hope you're not planning to top off those tanks. We're running light loads today. Weight and balance is pretty critical on this bird." Jonah didn't look up from her fuel quantity calculations. She'd heard variations of that assumption dozens of times since starting at Rockwell. The implication was always the same. Maintenance personnel who happened to be young women probably didn't understand the complexities of experimental aircraft operations. She finished her fuel load verification, documented the quantities in the aircraft logbook, and stepped away from the wing without acknowledging his comment. Her father had taught her early that responding to condescension only validated the assumption that she needed to justify her presence. Colonel David Mitchell hadn't raised a daughter who sought approval from people who confused confidence with competence. The test team began their mission briefing while Jonah completed her pre-flight inspection routine. She moved systematically around the aircraft, checking control surface movement, verifying that hydraulic lines showed no signs of leakage, ensuring that sensors and antennas were properly secured. Everything was perfect, because at Rockwell's Flight Test Division, everything always was. The facility's reputation depended on flawless preparation, and Jonah took pride in contributing to that standard, even if her role remained largely invisible. From her position near the hangar entrance, she observed the pilots reviewing flight test cards and discussing the day's objectives. The mission was straightforward: evaluate the aircraft's handling characteristics with only mechanical backup flight controls. Standard procedure for validating that pilots could maintain control if the primary fly-by-wire systems failed during critical phases of flight. She'd watched similar tests dozens of times, noting patterns that the pilots themselves might miss. Brooks favored slight right rudder inputs during climbing turns, probably compensating for an asymmetric loading technique she'd developed flying heavier aircraft. Turner had excellent situational awareness but tended to overcorrect when transitioning between different control modes. Rodriguez flew with textbook precision but sometimes hesitated when multiple systems required simultaneous attention. Chen remained an unknown quantity. His technique appeared solid during routine maneuvers, but experimental flying demanded responses to situations that couldn't be practiced in conventional aircraft. She found herself curious about how he would adapt when the X-47's unique characteristics challenged his training and experience. The morning's test schedule called for progressive complexity. First, basic handling evaluation with backup controls engaged. Then, simulated primary system failures during various flight phases. Finally, emergency procedures validation, including approaches and landings using only mechanical control inputs. Jonah knew the X-47 systems better than she probably should have. 18 months of fuel system maintenance had given her access to technical manuals, system schematics, and performance data that most maintenance personnel never examined. But she'd grown up in hangars, listening to her father discuss flight characteristics and aircraft behavior with the kind of technical depth that revealed the science behind aviation. She remembered those conversations clearly, sitting in the corner of base operations buildings while Colonel Mitchell debriefed flights with other pilots. Even as a child, she'd absorbed discussions of power settings, control inputs, and the subtle relationships between aircraft configuration and handling characteristics. Her father had encouraged her questions, explaining concepts that wouldn't appear in her textbooks until years later. The X-47 represented everything her father had loved about experimental flying: clean aerodynamics, advanced systems, and performance that pushed the boundaries of what aircraft could accomplish. But it also embodied the challenges that made test flying dangerous: unproven systems, unknown failure modes, and the constant possibility that theoretical calculations might not match real-world behavior. She watched the pilots complete their briefing and begin suiting up for the flight. Each carried themselves with a particular confidence that came from years of training and experience, but Jonah could see subtle differences in their preparation routines. Brooks methodically reviewed emergency procedures, probably a habit from years of flying single-seat fighters where backup options were limited. Turner focused on weather conditions and airport information, reflecting his background in carrier operations where environmental factors could change rapidly. Rodriguez spent extra time reviewing the aircraft's system status displays, approaching the test flight with the analytical mindset that had defined her academic and professional career. Chen appeared eager, perhaps too eager, checking and rechecking equipment that was already properly configured. The pre-flight briefing had covered standard emergency procedures, but Jonah knew from experience that actual emergencies rarely followed the scenarios outlined in training manuals. Aircraft systems failed in combinations that weren't anticipated. Weather conditions changed faster than forecasts predicted, and human factors created variables that couldn't be programmed into simulators. Her father had emphasized this repeatedly during their weekend flying sessions at small airports around Colorado. "Flying is about managing uncertainty," he'd said, demonstrating how minor changes in technique could dramatically affect aircraft performance. "The manual tells you what should happen. Experience teaches you what actually happens." Those lessons had continued until her father's diagnosis 18 months earlier. Parkinson's disease had gradually stolen his ability to fly, but not H. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His understanding of aviation. He still analyzed weather patterns, discussed aerodynamics, and shared insights about aircraft behavior that she carried with her every day. The irony wasn't lost on her. Colonel David Mitchell had trained dozens of military pilots, authored sections of the Air Force's experimental flight test manual, and accumulated more hours in prototype aircraft than most aviators flew in their entire careers. His knowledge and experience were documented in reports that influenced aircraft design throughout the industry. But his daughter, who had absorbed that knowledge through thousands of hours of informal instruction, possessed no official credentials. No pilot's license, no engineering degree yet, no recognition from the aviation community that had benefited from her father's expertise for decades. She was invisible by design and necessity, present but unnoticed, competent but uncredentialed. It was a position that had become comfortable, even if it sometimes felt limiting. Staying in the background meant avoiding scrutiny, and avoiding scrutiny meant protecting the job that kept her family financially stable while she completed her education. The test pilots were ready now, walking toward the X-47 with the purposeful stride of professionals approaching serious work. Captain Brooks would fly as mission commander, with Major Turner serving as safety observer and backup pilot. Dr. Rodriguez would monitor systems performance from the ground, while Lieutenant Chen assisted with data collection and communication protocols. Jonah gathered her tools and prepared to clear the hangar area. Her role in the morning's operations was essentially complete. Fuel loaded, systems checked, aircraft ready for flight. She would observe from the designated maintenance area, taking mental notes about aircraft performance that might inform future preparation procedures. She had no way of knowing that within the next hour, she would find herself at the center of a situation that would challenge everything she understood about her place in the aviation world. The morning had started like any other, with routine preparation and invisible competence. But sometimes the most significant moments begin with ordinary circumstances that suddenly demand extraordinary responses. The X-47 sat ready on the ramp, its experimental systems prepared for evaluation by some of the most qualified pilots in the country. Everything was proceeding according to plan, which, in the world of experimental flight testing, usually meant something unexpected was about to happen. Jonah's relationship with aviation began before she could walk. Colonel David Mitchell had been stationed at Peterson Air Force Base when she was born, and some of her earliest memories involved sitting in hangars while her father conducted pre-flight briefings with young pilots who looked at him with the kind of reverence reserved for living legends. The Mitchell family quarters had been filled with aviation artifacts that told the story of a distinguished career. Flight helmets from different aircraft, squadron patches representing assignments across 3 continents, and photographs of her father standing beside aircraft that pushed the boundaries of human flight. But what captured young Jonah's imagination wasn't the memorabilia. It was watching her father's eyes light up when he talked about the pure mechanics of flight. Every aircraft has its own personality, he would tell her during their weekend visits to small airports throughout Colorado. The key is learning to listen to what it's trying to tell you. Those early lessons had nothing to do with formal instruction, and everything to do with developing intuition about how machines and physics intersected in 3-dimensional space. By age 8, Jonah could identify aircraft types by their engine sounds alone. She understood the relationship between wing loading and stall characteristics before she encountered the mathematical formulas that described those phenomena. Her father had taught her to read weather patterns, calculate fuel consumption, and anticipate how atmospheric conditions would affect aircraft performance. The real education happened during their Saturday morning flights in Colonel Mitchell's personal aircraft, a meticulously maintained Cessna 182 that had served as their flying classroom for nearly a decade. He'd purchased the aircraft specifically for training purposes, modifying it with additional instruments and safety equipment that allowed him to demonstrate advanced concepts safely. Commercial pilots learn to fly by the numbers, he explained during one memorable lesson over the Rocky Mountains. Test pilots learn to fly by understanding what the numbers actually mean. He showed her how slight changes in control pressure could dramatically alter an aircraft's behavior, how power settings affected not just speed but also stability, and how environmental factors created variables that couldn't be programmed into flight management computers. Those lessons had continued through high school, becoming more sophisticated as Jonah's understanding of aerodynamics and engineering principles developed. Colonel Mitchell introduced concepts that wouldn't appear in standard pilot training curricula, envelope expansion techniques, handling qualities evaluation, and the systematic approach to flight testing that had defined his military career. He'd been meticulous about documenting her progress, maintaining logbooks that recorded not just flight time, but also specific skills and concepts mastered. By her 18th birthday, Jonah had accumulated more hours in various aircraft types than many commercial pilots possessed, though none of it counted toward official certifications because she'd never pursued formal licensing. The decision to skip traditional pilot training had been pragmatic rather than philosophical. Colonel Mitchell understood that his daughter possessed natural abilities and technical knowledge that exceeded most professional aviators. But he also recognized that the aviation industry remained skeptical of unconventional backgrounds. Master the fundamentals first, he'd advised. Credentials can come later, but understanding can't be faked. That philosophy had guided Jonah's academic choices as well. Instead of pursuing aviation degrees that emphasized operational procedures, she'd focused on aerospace engineering coursework that revealed the scientific principles underlying flight. Mathematics, physics, materials, science, and systems integration became her primary interests, subjects that explained why aircraft behaved as they did rather than simply describing what pilots should do in various situations. Her professors at Metro State had quickly recognized her unusual combination of theoretical knowledge and practical experience. Dr. Patricia Williams, who taught advanced aerodynamics, often used Jonah's insights to illustrate concepts that other students struggled to grasp. "You think like an engineer, but understand like a pilot," she'd observed. "That's a rare combination." The combination had also created challenges. Jonah found herself caught between two worlds, possessing expertise that wasn't formally recognized but knowledge that exceeded many credentialed professionals. She could analyze flight test data with the sophistication of experienced engineers, but her insights carried no official weight because she lacked the degrees and certifications that validated expertise in professional aviation. Working at Rockwell had provided unexpected opportunities to apply her knowledge. The maintenance position required understanding complex systems, interpreting technical documentation, and identifying potential problems before they affected flight operations. Tasks that might challenge technicians with years of experience came naturally to someone who'd grown up analyzing aircraft behavior with a legendary test pilot. She'd developed relationships with several of the facility's engineers, though they remained unaware of her background. Tom Rodriguez, the chief systems engineer, often sought her observations about aircraft performance anomalies. "You notice things," he'd told her after she'd identified a fuel flow pattern that correlated with handling irregularities. "Most maintenance folks just follow procedures, but you actually think about what the aircraft is telling you." Those informal consultations had become more frequent as her reputation for diagnostic accuracy spread among the technical staff. Engineers would casually mention problems they couldn't solve, then listen carefully to her suggestions about potential causes. She'd learned to phrase her insights carefully, avoiding technical language that might raise questions about her qualifications, while providing information that helped solve real problems. The irony of her situation wasn't lost on her. She was contributing to experimental flight testing at a level that exceeded many official participants, but her contributions remained invisible because they came from someone without credentials. The aviation community valued formal training and documented experience above intuitive understanding and practical knowledge. Her father's condition had added urgency to questions about her future. Parkinson's disease progressed unpredictably, but recent changes in his symptoms suggested that their window for extended conversations about aviation was narrowing. The hands that had controlled experimental aircraft with surgical precision now trembled when holding coffee cups, and the voice that had briefed complex test flights sometimes struggled with simple words. But his mind remained sharp, particularly when discussing aircraft and flying. Their evening conversations had become more focused, as if Colonel Mitchell was attempting to transfer a lifetime of knowledge before the opportunity disappeared. He'd begun sharing insights about aircraft development, test pilot techniques, and industry politics that he'd never discussed before. "The best test pilots aren't necessarily the most skilled aviators," he'd explained during a recent conversation. "They're the ones who can communicate what an aircraft is doing, why it's doing it, and how to make it better. Technical knowledge without communication skills is just personal expertise. But communication skills without technical knowledge is just storytelling." Those words had resonated with Jonah because they described her current dilemma. She possessed the technical knowledge and practical experience to contribute meaningfully to experimental aviation, but she lacked the formal credentials that would give her opinions weight in professional discussions. She could identify problems that stumped experienced engineers, but her insights remained limited to informal conversations with colleagues who didn't fully understand the depth of her expertise. The financial pressures facing her family had added complexity to her career decisions. Her mother's cancer treatments required expensive medications that insurance covered only partially, and Colonel Mitchell's disability compensation barely covered their basic living expenses. Jonah's income from Rockwell, combined with her weekend work at the FBO and tutoring fees, provided the margin that kept them financially stable. But pursuing formal pilot training or accelerating her engineering degree would require sacrificing either income or time with her father during his remaining healthy years. She'd calculated the trade-offs repeatedly, always reaching the same conclusion. Immediate financial stability took precedence over long-term career advancement, at least until her mother's treatments concluded and her father's condition stabilized. The calculations had become more precise as she'd watched other families navigate similar situations. Medical expenses consumed savings with frightening efficiency, and disability benefits provided security only as long as recipients remained eligible for programs that could change with political winds. She'd learned to think in terms of worst-case scenarios, planning for contingencies that she hoped would never materialize. Working at Rockwell provided more than income, though. The position offered daily exposure to cutting-edge aviation technology and access to technical discussions that enhanced her understanding of experimental flight testing. She was essentially receiving an advanced education in aerospace engineering while earning money to support her family's medical expenses. The opportunity to observe elite test pilots had proven particularly valuable. Each aviator brought different perspectives and techniques to experimental flying, and Jonah had learned to identify the subtle differences that distinguished competent pilots from exceptional ones. Captain Brooks approached unknown aircraft with systematic caution, methodically exploring handling characteristics before attempting challenging maneuvers. Major Turner relied on instinctive responses developed through years of high-stress operations, adapting quickly when aircraft behavior deviated from expectations. Rodriguez combined analytical thinking with practical experience, treating each flight as both operational necessity and scientific experiment. She documented observations with academic precision while maintaining the situational awareness essential for safe test flying. Lieutenant Chen possessed excellent fundamental skills, but limited experience with the kind of edge cases that defined experimental aviation. Jonah had also learned to recognize the subtle indicators that predicted how different pilots would respond to unexpected situations. Brooks' methodical approach meant she rarely encountered surprises, but when anomalies occurred, she sometimes hesitated while analyzing options. Turner's experiential background allowed rapid adaptation to changing conditions, but his responses sometimes prioritized immediate solutions over long-term aircraft preservation. Rodriguez's analytical mindset provided excellent problem-solving capabilities, but her academic background occasionally created delays when situations demanded immediate action. Chen's eagerness to prove himself sometimes led to overconfidence when faced with scenarios that exceeded his training and experience. Understanding these patterns had become second nature, partly because they reflected lessons her father had taught about pilot psychology, and partly because she'd observed similar characteristics among the aviators she'd encountered throughout her life. Every pilot developed personal techniques for managing uncertainty, and those techniques revealed both strengths and limitations when circumstances pushed beyond normal operations. The knowledge felt increasingly relevant as she watched the morning's test flight preparations. The X-47's advanced systems created opportunities for failure modes that wouldn't occur in conventional aircraft, and the backup control systems required techniques that few modern pilots practiced regularly. She could anticipate several scenarios where the combination of aircraft characteristics and pilot responses might create challenging situations. But her role remained limited to observation and documentation. She could identify potential problems, but her insights carried no official weight in mission planning or execution. The disconnect between her understanding and her authority had become a constant source of frustration, particularly when she recognized risks that others missed. Her father had faced similar challenges early in his career, when junior officers with innovative ideas encountered senior leadership resistant to change. "Timing matters," he'd told her. "Sometimes the best idea proposed at the wrong moment gets ignored, while a good idea presented at the right time changes everything. Learning to recognize those moments is as important as having the ideas themselves." Jonah sensed that such a moment was approaching, though she couldn't predict its exact nature. The X-47 represented technology that pushed beyond conventional flight testing experience, and the morning's mission involved scenarios that would challenge even experienced pilots. Something about the combination felt potentially significant, as if circumstances were aligning in ways that might demand responses beyond standard procedures. She couldn't know that within hours, those circumstances would create exactly the kind of moment her father had described, where the right insight presented at the critical time would change not just her own future, but also the perspectives of people who had never imagined that expertise could exist without credentials, or that the most important knowledge sometimes came from the most unexpected sources. The morning briefing concluded with the precision that characterized all operations at Rockwell's Flight Test Division. Captain Brooks reviewed emergency procedures one final time, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd survived situations that existed only as theoretical scenarios for most aviators. The X-47's backup control systems would be evaluated through a series of progressively challenging maneuvers, beginning with basic handling and advancing to full approach and landing procedures. Dr. Rodriguez positioned herself at the ground control station, multiple monitors displaying real-time telemetry from the aircraft's sensors and cameras. Her role involved monitoring system performance, documenting anomalies, and providing technical consultation if unexpected conditions developed during the flight. The data collection protocols had been refined through dozens of previous test flights, creating a comprehensive picture of aircraft behavior under various conditions. Major Turner conducted his final walk-around inspection, checking control surface movement and verifying that all external components appeared properly secured. His carrier aviation background had instilled habits that exceeded standard procedures, and he approached every flight as if it might involve landing on a moving ship in challenging weather. The thoroughness reflected hard-learned lessons about the consequences of overlooking seemingly minor details. Lieutenant Chen assisted with communication checks and data recording equipment, eager to contribute meaningfully to operations conducted by aviators he'd studied during his training at test pilot school. His textbook knowledge was comprehensive, but experimental flying demanded responses to situations that couldn't be simulated or anticipated through classroom instruction. This flight represented an opportunity to observe how theory translated into practice when aircraft systems operated outside normal parameters. The X-47 sat on the ramp like a predator preparing to hunt, its swept wings and angular surfaces reflecting the morning sun in patterns that suggested speed even while stationary. The experimental aircraft represented millions of dollars of research and development, incorporating technologies that pushed the boundaries of what was considered feasible in modern aviation. Its fly-by-wire control systems had been designed to handle situations that would overwhelm conventional aircraft, but today's test would evaluate what happened when those advanced systems were unavailable. Jonah watched the pre-flight preparations from her designated observation area near the hangar entrance, mentally reviewing the technical specifications and performance parameters she'd memorized during 18 months of working with the aircraft. The X-47's backup control systems operated through mechanical linkages that bypassed the computer-mediated inputs used during normal operations. Few pilots had experience with such systems because modern aircraft rarely required manual reversion, and training simulators couldn't replicate the subtle differences in control feel and response timing. The contrast between the test pilots and their experimental aircraft created an interesting dynamic. Each aviator brought extensive experience with conventional aircraft, but the X-47's unique characteristics demanded adaptation to handling qualities that existed nowhere else in aviation. Previous test flights had revealed several quirks that distinguished this aircraft from more familiar designs, and today's mission would determine whether pilots could maintain control when the aircraft's computer assistance was unavailable. Captain Brooks climbed into the cockpit first, settling into the ejection seat with the methodical movements of someone who'd performed similar preparations hundreds of times. The X-47's cockpit differed significantly from production aircraft, featuring displays and controls that reflected its experimental nature. Multiple warning lights, unusual switch configurations, and instrument layouts that prioritized data collection over operational convenience created an environment that challenged even experienced pilots. Her pre-start procedures included system checks that would be unnecessary in conventional aircraft. The fly-by-wire computers required initialization sequences, backup control systems needed verification, and emergency procedures demanded confirmation that all safety systems operated correctly. The complexity reflected the aircraft's experimental status, where every component represented unproven technology that might behave differently than design specifications predicted. The engine start sequence proceeded smoothly, producing the characteristic whine of high-performance turbofan engines spooling up to operating parameters. Ground personnel cleared the area as exhaust temperatures reached levels that could damage equipment or injure personnel. The X-47's engines had been modified to provide additional power for research purposes, creating thrust levels that exceeded most production aircraft in its size category. Taxi procedures revealed the first hints of the aircraft's unique characteristics. The X-47's nose-wheel steering felt different from conventional designs, requiring control inputs that seemed counterintuitive to pilots accustomed to standard aircraft. Captain Brooks adapted quickly, but Jonah noticed slight overcorrections that suggested the learning curve would be steeper than anticipated. Radio communications with the control tower confirmed clearance for the test flight, with special provisions that restricted other traffic from the area during experimental operations. The airspace reservation extended from ground level to 15,000 feet, providing adequate room for maneuvers that might require rapid altitude or heading changes if control problems developed. Emergency services had been notified and positioned strategically around the airport in case the test flight encountered difficulties that required immediate response. The takeoff roll demonstrated both the aircraft's impressive performance and its demanding handling characteristics. The X-47 accelerated faster than conventional aircraft of similar size, but its control responses required techniques that differed subtly from standard procedures. Captain Brooks managed the takeoff successfully, though ground observers could see minor corrections that indicated she was still adapting to the aircraft's particular requirements. Initial flight maneuvers proceeded according to plan. Basic handling evaluation, with all systems operating normally established baseline performance parameters that would be compared with backup control system behavior. The X-47 responded predictably to control inputs, though its fly-by-wire systems provided artificial stability that masked the aircraft's natural flying characteristics. Dr. Rodriguez monitored telemetry data from her ground station, noting performance parameters that would be analyzed extensively after the flight concluded. The initial results confirmed design predictions, but experimental flying often revealed discrepancies between theoretical calculations and actual aircraft behavior. Previous test flights had identified several areas where the X-47's performance deviated from computer models, and today's mission might reveal additional anomalies. The transition to backup control systems occurred at 8,000 feet over the designated test area, safely away from populated regions and other aircraft traffic. Captain Brooks followed the prescribed procedures for disabling the fly-by-wire computers, effectively reverting the X-47 to mechanical control inputs similar to aircraft designs from previous decades. The change was immediately apparent to ground observers monitoring radio communications. "Control feel is definitely different," Brooks reported, her voice maintaining professional calm despite obvious concentration required to maintain stable flight. "Heavier than expected, and there's a lag in response that wasn't present with the computers engaged." The observations matched predictions from engineering analysis, but actual experience provided details that computer modeling couldn't capture. Simple maneuvers revealed the extent of the challenge facing test pilots. Turns required more control input than anticipated, and maintaining altitude demanded constant attention to power settings and control surface positions. The X-47's advanced aerodynamics had been designed to work in conjunction with computer assistance, and flying without that support felt like operating a completely different aircraft. Major Turner observed from the ground control station, comparing Captain Brooks' radio reports with his own experience flying similar aircraft. His background included extensive experience with older aircraft that lacked computer assistance, and he recognized the techniques required for maintaining control under such conditions. "She's working harder than she should need to," he commented to Dr. Rodriguez. "The control harmony isn't what we expected from wind tunnel testing." The situation deteriorated gradually rather than suddenly. Captain Brooks's initial reports described manageable but challenging handling characteristics, but subsequent maneuvers revealed increasing difficulties. The X-47's natural stability was marginal without computer augmentation, requiring constant pilot attention to maintain desired flight paths. What had been designed as a routine evaluation was becoming a demonstration of the limits of human control authority. "I'm having trouble maintaining consistent airspeed," Brooks reported during a climbing turn maneuver. "Power changes seem to affect pitch attitude more than anticipated, and trimming out control forces isn't working like the manual predicted." The professional concern in her voice was evident to everyone monitoring the radio frequencies, though she maintained the calm demeanor expected of experienced test pilots. Dr. Rodriguez watched performance parameters that confirmed the pilot's observations. The aircraft was flying safely, but maintaining precise control required workload levels that would be unsustainable during extended operations. Engineering predictions had underestimated the difficulty of managing the X-47's flight characteristics without computer assistance, and the gap between theory and practice was becoming evident to everyone involved in the test. Lieutenant Chen documented the radio communications and performance data, recognizing that today's flight was revealing important information about the aircraft's limitations. His training had emphasized the importance of learning from test flights that didn't proceed according to plan, and this mission was providing exactly that kind of educational opportunity. The difference between simulated emergencies and actual aircraft behavior was becoming clearly apparent. The critical moment arrived during approach procedures back to Denver International. Captain Brooks had successfully completed the planned maneuvers, demonstrating that skilled pilots could maintain control of the X-47 using only backup systems. But the approach phase demanded precision that proved elusive with the aircraft's challenging handling characteristics. "I'm getting some unusual control responses during configuration changes," Brooks reported as she lowered the landing gear and extended flaps. "Each configuration change seems to affect control harmony differently, and I'm having to make larger corrections than normal to maintain the approach path." The professionalism in her voice couldn't entirely mask the concentration required to manage the aircraft under increasingly demanding conditions. The approach continued with modifications to standard procedures, reflecting the additional workload imposed by the aircraft's backup control systems. Air traffic control had been briefed on the experimental nature of the flight and provided priority handling that eliminated external pressure from other aircraft operations. The focus remained entirely on safely completing the test mission, despite the challenging handling characteristics. 3 miles from the runway, the situation became critical. "I've lost primary hydraulic pressure," Brooks announced, her voice remaining calm but urgent. "Backup systems are engaging, but control response is becoming very sluggish. I'm not sure I can maintain precise enough control for a normal landing approach." The radio transmission marked the transition from routine test flight to potential emergency situation. Ground observers could see the X-47's flight path becoming increasingly erratic as Captain Brooks struggled to maintain control with severely degraded systems. The aircraft remained flyable, But the precision required for safe landing approaches was clearly beyond what the backup control systems could provide. Emergency procedures would need to be implemented, though the specific nature of the problem meant that standard checklists might not address the unique combination of system failures. Dr. Rodriguez coordinated with emergency services while monitoring telemetry data that confirmed the severity of the situation. Multiple system malfunctions were occurring simultaneously, creating a scenario that exceeded the complexity of any previously experienced emergency. The X-47 was demonstrating exactly why experimental aircraft required test pilots with exceptional skills and extensive emergency training. Major Turner prepared to provide radio assistance, drawing on his experience with similar emergencies in other aircraft types. But the X-47's unique characteristics meant that conventional emergency procedures might not apply, and solutions would need to be developed in real time based on the aircraft's actual behavior rather than theoretical predictions. The morning's routine test flight had become a genuine emergency that would challenge everyone involved, creating exactly the kind of situation where unconventional solutions might prove more valuable than standard procedures. And in the maintenance area, Jonah Mitchell was beginning to realize that her 18 months of observing the X-47's behavior had prepared her for exactly this moment. The emergency unfolded with the relentless progression that characterized aviation crises. What had begun as manageable handling difficulties escalated into a situation that demanded immediate decisions with potentially catastrophic consequences. Captain Brooks found herself fighting an aircraft that seemed determined to resist every control input, the X-47's backup systems providing inadequate authority for the precision required during approach operations. "Control inputs are becoming increasingly ineffective," Brooks transmitted, her professional composure masking the physical effort required to maintain even basic flight parameters. "I'm having to use full control deflection just to make minor heading corrections, and the aircraft wants to pitch nose down during power reductions." The description painted a picture of an aircraft approaching the limits of controllability, where pilot technique alone might not be sufficient to ensure safe outcomes. Rodriguez coordinated emergency response procedures from her ground station, following protocols developed for experimental aircraft emergencies. Fire and rescue equipment moved into position around the runway, while medical personnel prepared for potential evacuation scenarios. The emergency response reflected the reality that experimental flying carried risks that didn't exist in routine aviation operations, and comprehensive preparation was essential when those risks materialized into actual emergencies. Air traffic control cleared all other aircraft from the airport vicinity, providing unrestricted airspace for whatever emergency procedures might become necessary. The tower controller, experienced with experimental flight operations, maintained professional calm while coordinating resources that might be required if the situation deteriorated further. Standard emergency checklists were being reviewed, though everyone recognized that the X-47's unique characteristics might render conventional procedures inadequate. Major Turner analyzed the developing emergency through the lens of his carrier aviation experience, where difficult landings were routine and emergency procedures were practiced until they became instinctive. But carrier operations involved proven aircraft with predictable handling characteristics, while the X-47 represented unknown territory where standard techniques might not apply. His recommendations would need to balance aggressive problem-solving with conservative risk management. Lieutenant Chen documented every radio transmission and performance parameter, recognizing that this emergency would provide valuable data for future experimental programs, regardless of its outcome. His academic training had emphasized the importance of learning from both successful and unsuccessful test flights, and today's crisis was generating exactly the kind of information that influenced aircraft design and pilot training programs. The X-47's flight path became increasingly erratic as Captain Brooks struggled with control systems that provided inadequate response to her inputs. Each attempt to correct the aircraft's attitude required greater control deflection, and the lag between input and response was growing longer. The situation suggested that multiple system failures were occurring simultaneously, creating a cascade of problems that exceeded the scope of any single emergency procedure. "I'm going to attempt a straight-in approach," Brooks announced, abandoning the standard traffic pattern in favor of the most direct path to the runway. "Control authority is decreasing, and I don't think I can maintain stable flight long enough for extended maneuvering." The decision reflected sound emergency management, prioritizing immediate safety over standard procedures that might not be feasible under current conditions. Ground observers could see the X-47's unusual flight characteristics as it approached the airport. The aircraft's normally precise flight path had become a series of corrections and overcorrections, with control surfaces deflected to positions that would be unnecessary during normal operations. Emergency vehicles positioned themselves along the runway, prepared for landing scenarios that might range from hard touchdowns to complete loss of control during the approach. Dr. Rodriguez monitored telemetry data that confirmed the severity of the emergency. Multiple hydraulic systems were operating at reduced pressure, backup electrical systems were struggling to maintain adequate power, and control surface actuators were showing signs of mechanical binding that hadn't been anticipated during design phases. The combination created exactly the kind of unpredictable emergency situation that experimental flying was designed to identify and address. The approach phase revealed the full extent of the X-47's controllability problems. Each power adjustment created pitch changes that required immediate correction, while heading control demanded constant rudder inputs that seemed to have delayed and unpredictable effects. Captain Brooks was demonstrating exceptional piloting skills, but the aircraft's degraded systems were approaching the limits of what human control authority could manage. Power setting changes are causing significant pitch excursions, Brooks reported during the approach. I'm having to anticipate the aircraft's responses, but the delay between input and effect is variable. This isn't going to be a normal landing. The transmission captured the essence of experimental flying, where pilots encountered situations that couldn't be anticipated through training or simulation. 2 miles from the runway, the situation reached a critical decision point. The X-47 remained airborne and marginally controllable, but the precision required for safe landing approaches was clearly beyond what the degraded control systems could provide. Emergency procedures would need to be implemented, though the specific combination of failures meant that standard checklists might not address the actual problems being encountered. Major Turner stepped forward to provide radio guidance, drawing on his experience with emergency approaches in challenging conditions. "Sarah, consider increasing your approach speed by at least 20 knots, he advised. If control authority is decreasing, additional airspeed might give you more effectiveness from the control surfaces. This suggestion reflected sound aerodynamic principles, though the X-47's unique characteristics made it impossible to predict whether conventional techniques would prove effective. The increased approach speed helped marginally, providing slightly improved control response, but also created new challenges related to landing distance and touchdown precision. Captain Brooks found herself managing trade-offs between controllability and landing performance, while simultaneously dealing with systems that continued to degrade during the approach. The workload was approaching levels that might overwhelm even experienced test pilots. "I'm not confident about my ability to execute a safe landing with current control authority," Brooks transmitted, the professional acknowledgement carrying implications that everyone understood. "We need to consider alternative procedures or abort the approach for further troubleshooting." The statement reflected the harsh reality of experimental flying, where admitting limitations was essential for preventing disasters. Dr. Rodriguez consulted with engineering personnel who had been monitoring the flight, seeking technical solutions that might improve the aircraft's controllability. The X-47's backup systems had been designed for exactly this type of emergency, but actual performance was deviating significantly from theoretical predictions. Real-time problem-solving would be required to develop procedures that address the aircraft's actual behavior rather than design specifications. Lieutenant Chen observed the emergency procedures with growing concern, recognizing that his textbook knowledge provided limited guidance for situations this complex. The gap between academic training and operational reality was becoming starkly apparent, and he found himself questioning whether standard pilot training adequately prepared aviators for genuine experimental flying emergencies. The decision to abort the first approach attempt reflected sound judgment, but it also consumed fuel and created time pressure for developing solutions. The X-47 couldn't remain airborne indefinitely with degraded systems, and each additional approach attempt carried risks that might be avoided through more thorough preparation. Emergency management required balancing immediate safety concerns with long-term resource limitations. Ground personnel prepared for extended emergency operations, recognizing that resolving the X-47's controllability problems might require multiple approach attempts and considerable troubleshooting. Fire and rescue equipment remained positioned around the runway, while technical personnel analyzed telemetry data for insights that might improve the aircraft's handling characteristics or suggest alternative emergency procedures. The second approach attempt began with modified procedures designed to address the specific control problems that had been identified. Captain Brooks increased her approach speed further and used power settings that minimized pitch excursions, while ground personnel provided continuous radio guidance based on observed aircraft behavior. The collaborative approach reflected the experimental nature of the situation, where solutions needed to be developed in real time. Control response is still inadequate for precision approaches, Brooks reported during the second attempt. I can maintain general flight path control, but I don't have enough authority for the fine adjustments needed during landing. The assessment was brutally honest, acknowledging that pilot skill alone might not be sufficient to overcome the aircraft's systemic control problems. The second approach was also aborted, confirming that the X-47's control problems exceeded what could be managed through conventional emergency procedures. Alternative solutions would need to be developed, though the available options were limited by the aircraft's unique characteristics and the specific nature of its system failures. Time pressure was increasing as fuel consumption continued, and system degradation potentially worsened. Engineering consultations suggested several theoretical solutions, but implementing them would require modifications to standard procedures that had never been tested under actual emergency conditions. The gap between theoretical possibilities and practical implementation was becoming a critical factor in determining whether the emergency could be resolved successfully. Innovation would be required, but innovation during emergencies carried its own risks. Major Turner proposed attempting a no-flap approach that might reduce the aircraft's configuration complexity and improve controllability. The suggestion had merit based on aerodynamic principles, but it would also increase landing speeds and require longer runway distances. Risk management became a matter of choosing between known challenges and unknown variables, both of which carried significant safety implications. It was during the discussion of alternative approach procedures that Lieutenant Chen made the comment that would change everything. "Maybe we're overthinking this," he said, frustration evident in his voice. "The aircraft is basically unflyable with these control problems. No pilot should be expected to land something that won't respond properly to control inputs." The statement was intended as professional assessment, but it carried implications about pilot capability that had not been explicitly addressed. From her position near the hangar, Jonah Mitchell had been listening to the radio communications and observing the emergency procedures with growing concern. Her 18 months of working with the X-47 had given her insights into the aircraft's behavior that might not be apparent to pilots who had limited experience with its specific characteristics. She understood the control system interactions and had observed handling anomalies that might be relevant to the current emergency. But Lieutenant Chen's comment about the aircraft being unflyable touched something deeper than technical disagreement. The assertion that no pilot should be expected to handle such conditions seemed to dismiss the possibility that alternative techniques might exist, or that different approaches to the control problems might yield better results. It was the kind of absolute statement that her father had taught her to question, particularly when it came from someone with limited experience in the specific situation being discussed. The emergency was reaching a decision point where creative solutions might be more valuable than conventional procedures, and Jonah found herself in possession of knowledge that might prove relevant to the developing crisis. Her understanding of the X-47's control system behavior, combined with techniques her father had taught her for handling degraded aircraft, suggested approaches that hadn't been considered by the test pilots currently managing the emergency. The moment had arrived when staying silent might mean watching a preventable disaster unfold, while speaking up would risk exposing herself to scrutiny about qualifications she technically didn't possess. It was exactly the kind of situation her father had described, where timing and courage were as important as knowledge, and where the right insight presented at the critical moment might change everything. The words left Jonah's mouth before her rational mind could intercept them. "It's not unflyable." The statement cut through the tense radio chatter and hushed conversations around the emergency command center like a blade through silk. Every head turned toward the maintenance area where she stood, tools still in her hands, looking as surprised as anyone else that she'd spoken. Lieutenant Chen turned first, his expression shifting from professional concern to incredulous confusion. "Excuse me?" The question carried the weight of 18 months of assumptions about her role and capabilities. Assumptions that had just been challenged by someone who wasn't supposed to have opinions about experimental aircraft emergencies. Dr. Rodriguez paused her coordination with engineering personnel, her analytical mind immediately focusing on the unexpected input from an unexpected source. Major Turner stepped back from the radio console, his carrier-trained instincts recognizing that critical information sometimes came from surprising directions. The emergency operations had suddenly acquired a new variable that no one had anticipated. "The control problem isn't what you think it is," Jonah continued, her voice gaining strength as she committed to a path that would either validate her expertise or expose her limitations in front of the most qualified aviators she'd ever encountered. "The hydraulic failure is masking a trim tab malfunction that's creating the control lag. I've seen it twice before during maintenance runs." Major Turner studied her with the intense focus he normally reserved for emergency checklists and approach procedures. "You've seen this specific problem before?" The question was direct but not dismissive, reflecting his experience with situations where critical information came from unexpected sources during carrier operations. Jonah nodded, her heart racing as she realized there was no retreat from this moment. 3 months ago during a ground taxi test, and again 6 weeks ago during low-speed flight tests. The trim tab actuators bind when hydraulic pressure drops below 2,800 psi, but the binding creates a feedback loop that makes it seem like the primary control surfaces aren't responding properly. Dr. Rodriguez looked up from her telemetry displays, her scientific training immediately engaging with the technical specifics Jonah had presented. "The trim tab data isn't something we monitor in real time during flight operations," she said, more to herself than to the group. "If there's a binding condition affecting control harmony, it wouldn't show up in our standard emergency procedures." The radio crackled with Captain Brooks' voice, reporting her position for a potential third approach attempt. The urgency in her transmission reminded everyone that theoretical discussions needed to translate into practical solutions quickly. Fuel consumption was becoming a factor, and the X-47's degraded systems might continue deteriorating during extended flight operations. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Major Turner asked Jonah, his tone carrying the careful neutrality of someone evaluating information from an unfamiliar source. Military aviation had taught him that expertise sometimes resided in unexpected places, but it had also taught him to verify claims before acting on them. Jonah took a breath, knowing that her next words would either establish her credibility or destroy any possibility of being taken seriously. The trim tabs can be manually reset using emergency override procedures, but it requires specific control inputs in a precise sequence while maintaining exact power settings. Captain Brooks is fighting the aircraft instead of working with its natural tendencies. "And you know how to work with its natural tendencies?" Lieutenant Chen's question carried skepticism that bordered on sarcasm, though his tone remained professionally controlled. The implication was clear. Maintenance personnel didn't possess the specialized knowledge required for emergency flight operations. "I know this aircraft," Jonah replied simply. "I've worked on its systems longer than anyone here has flown it, and I understand how the control components interact under degraded conditions." The statement was factual rather than boastful, but it carried implications about expertise that challenged conventional assumptions about qualifications and experience. Dr. Rodriguez was already pulling up diagnostic data on her secondary displays, searching for information that might support or contradict Jonah's assessment. The scientific method demanded verification of hypotheses before accepting conclusions, and emergency situations required even more rigorous evaluation of potential solutions. "Show me what you're seeing in the data," she said, gesturing to Jonah toward the monitoring station. The next few minutes would determine whether 18 months of observation and a lifetime of informal aviation education had prepared Jonah for exactly this moment, or whether she was about to embarrass herself in front of professionals whose judgment could affect her future in the aviation industry. But Captain Brooks was still airborne in a degraded aircraft, and theoretical concerns about credibility seemed less important than practical solutions to immediate problems. Jonah approached the monitoring station with the purposeful stride her father had taught her to use when entering unfamiliar cockpits or challenging situations. Confidence without arrogance, competence without overstatement. The displays showed exactly what she had expected: control surface positions that indicated binding conditions rather than simple hydraulic pressure loss. "Look at the trim tab position indicators," she said, pointing to data streams that most observers had overlooked in favor of more obvious system status displays. "They're showing static positions even when Captain Brooks is making control inputs. That means the tabs aren't responding to her commands, which creates the lag and reduced authority she's experiencing." Dr. Rodriguez studied the data with growing interest, her engineering background allowing her to follow Jonah's technical analysis. The trim tab positions were indeed static, a condition that would create exactly the control problems being reported from the aircraft. "How do you know about the emergency override procedures?" she asked, genuine curiosity replacing initial skepticism. "Technical Manual Section 4.7.3, Jonah replied without hesitation. Emergency Control System Recovery Procedures. Most pilots never read that section because normal operations don't require manual trim tab management, but maintenance personnel need to understand the backup systems for ground testing and troubleshooting." Major Turner had been listening to the exchange while monitoring radio communications from the aircraft. His career experience included situations where unconventional solutions had proven more effective than standard procedures, and he recognized the sound of genuine technical knowledge. "What would the override procedures involve?" he asked. Jonah's answer came with the precision that reflected years of studying aircraft systems and emergency procedures. Specific control stick positions, combined with rudder inputs and power settings that bypass the automatic trim system and allow manual control of the trim tabs. It's counterintuitive because you have to stop fighting the aircraft and work with its tendencies while manually adjusting the control balance. "That's not something you learn from reading manuals," Lieutenant Chen observed, his skepticism now mixed with genuine curiosity. The procedures Jonah was describing required understanding that went beyond technical documentation, suggesting experience that didn't match her official role at the facility. "My father taught me emergency procedures for aircraft with degraded control systems," Jonah explained, the first personal information she'd shared during the crisis. "He always said that understanding how aircraft systems fail was more important than knowing how they're supposed to work normally." The mention of her father created a subtle shift in the group's attention. Professional aviators understood that aviation knowledge was often transmitted through informal mentorship, and expertise could exist outside official training programs. Dr. Rodriguez looked up from her displays with a different expression, one that suggested she was beginning to take Jonah's input more seriously. "Who was your father?" Major Turner asked, the question carrying implications about credibility and background that might affect how her suggestions were evaluated. "Colonel David Mitchell," Jonah replied, watching for recognition that might validate her unconventional education. "He spent 15 years as a test pilot and instructor before his retirement." The information was presented simply, without elaboration, allowing the listeners to draw their own conclusions about the quality of instruction she might have received. The recognition was immediate and transformative. Major Turner's expression shifted from careful evaluation to genuine respect, while Dr. Rodriguez straightened in her chair with the alert attention of someone who had just learned important information. Lieutenant Chen's skepticism was replaced by obvious surprise, as if pieces of a puzzle were suddenly fitting together in unexpected ways. "Dave Mitchell was your father?" Dr. Rodriguez asked, her voice carrying the reverence reserved for legendary figures in experimental aviation. "I read his papers on control system integration during my graduate studies. His work on handling qualities evaluation is still considered definitive in some areas." The validation changed everything. Suddenly, Jonah wasn't just a maintenance worker with unexpected opinions, but the daughter of one of the most respected test pilots in modern aviation history. Her technical knowledge and understanding of emergency procedures gained credibility that transformed her from interesting observer to potential expert consultant. Major Turner was already reaching for the radio microphone, recognizing that time pressure required immediate action rather than extended verification procedures. "Sarah, we might have identified the specific nature of your control problem," he transmitted. "Stand by for some unconventional troubleshooting procedures." Captain Brooks' response carried the controlled tension of someone managing an aircraft that demanded constant attention. "I'm willing to try anything that might improve controllability. Current configuration is marginal at best, and I don't think I can maintain stable flight much longer." The radio transmission emphasized the urgency of the situation while creating pressure for everyone involved in developing solutions. Theoretical knowledge would need to translate into practical procedures quickly, and there would be limited opportunity for trial and error. Emergency management required confidence in solutions before implementing them, but it also demanded action when delay might create worse problems. "The procedures I'm suggesting require precise timing and coordination," Jonah said, addressing the group but focusing on Major Turner, who would be responsible for communicating instructions to Captain Brooks. "Each step has to be completed in sequence, and the control inputs have to be maintained exactly as specified, or the manual override won't engage properly." Dr. Rodriguez was documenting everything, Recognizing that regardless of the outcome, this emergency was generating important information about both aircraft behavior and emergency procedures. The interaction between theoretical knowledge and practical application was creating exactly the kind of learning opportunity that advanced both aviation technology and pilot training programs. Lieutenant Chen had moved to a secondary radio position, preparing to assist with communication procedures that might become complex if the troubleshooting required detailed coordination between ground personnel and the airborne pilot. His academic training was proving valuable for documentation and protocol management, even if his flight experience was limited compared to the other team members. "Sarah, we're going to try a manual trim tab reset procedure," Major Turner transmitted, his voice carrying the calm authority that had guided countless carrier approaches in challenging conditions. "It's going to require specific control inputs that might feel counterintuitive, but we have reason to believe it will restore normal control authority." The radio response came quickly, reflecting the pilot's eagerness to regain normal aircraft control. "Ready to copy procedures. Anything that might improve the situation would be welcome right now." Jonah found herself at the center of an emergency response, providing technical guidance that might determine whether one of the country's most advanced experimental aircraft could be landed safely. The moment her father had prepared her for throughout her childhood had arrived, demanding that she translate years of informal education into practical solutions for a crisis that was unfolding in real time. The next few minutes would test not only her technical knowledge and understanding of aircraft systems, but also her ability to communicate complex procedures clearly under pressure while managing the weight of responsibility for outcomes that could affect both human safety and the future of experimental aviation programs. The manual trim tab reset procedure began with instructions that challenged everything Captain Brooks understood about conventional aircraft control. Instead of fighting the X-47's tendency to pitch nose down during power reductions, Jonah's guidance called for working with that tendency while making specific control inputs that seemed counterintuitive to standard flight training. "Reduce power to 70% and allow the nose to drop naturally," Major Turner transmitted, relaying Jonah's instructions with the careful precision of someone who understood that unconventional procedures required exact execution. "Don't try to correct the pitch attitude with elevator inputs. The goal is to establish a specific flight condition that will allow the trim tab override to engage." Captain Brooks' response carried the controlled tension of a pilot implementing procedures that contradicted her instinctive responses. 70% power set, allowing nose attitude to stabilize. "This feels completely wrong, but I'm following the procedures exactly as specified." The professionalism in her voice couldn't mask the difficulty of deliberately allowing an aircraft to behave in ways that normal training taught pilots to prevent. Dr. Rodriguez monitored telemetry data that confirmed the aircraft was responding to the initial steps of Jonah's procedure. The X-47's flight path was stabilizing in ways that hadn't been achieved during previous approach attempts, though the aircraft's attitude and configuration remained outside normal parameters. "Trim tab position indicators are beginning to show movement," she reported, the first evidence that the override procedure might be working. The second phase required even more precise coordination. Jonah stood beside the radio console, her voice calm but focused as she provided real-time guidance based on her understanding of the aircraft's systems. "Now apply left rudder pressure while simultaneously moving the control stick to the right. Hold those inputs for exactly 10 seconds while maintaining the current power setting." Quote. The instructions seemed to violate basic principles of coordinated flight, but they were designed to activate mechanical linkages that bypassed the failed hydraulic systems. Captain Brooks executed the maneuver with the kind of precision that separated test pilots from conventional aviators, trusting procedures that felt fundamentally wrong based on her training and experience. "Control inputs applied as specified," Brooks transmitted. "I can feel something changing in the control response, though it's subtle. The aircraft seems to be settling into a more stable attitude than I've been able to achieve since the emergency began." The observation suggested that Jonah's procedure was producing the intended effects, though the full impact wouldn't be apparent until the sequence was completed. Lieutenant Chen watched the procedure with fascination that bordered on disbelief. The maintenance worker he'd dismissed as someone who didn't know how to fly was providing emergency guidance that exceeded anything in his test pilot school training. The gap between academic knowledge and practical expertise was becoming starkly apparent, forcing him to reconsider assumptions he'd held about qualifications and competence. The final phase of the reset procedure required the most counterintuitive inputs. Apply full right rudder while pulling the control stick back to the rear stop. Jonah instructed, her voice carrying the confidence that came from understanding exactly what should happen when the manual override engaged. Hold those inputs until you feel a definite change in control force, then neutralize all controls and assess the aircraft's response. Captain Brooks executed the final sequence with complete trust in procedures she didn't fully understand, demonstrating the kind of professional judgment that allowed test pilots to evaluate unknown aircraft safely. Full right rudder and aft stick applied. I can feel increased control force loading, and there's a definite change in the aircraft's behavior. Neutralizing controls now. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Control response is completely different, Brooks reported, her voice carrying amazement that professional aviators rarely express during flight operations. I have normal control authority restored. Repeat, normal control authority is restored. Whatever procedure we just completed has resolved the controllability problem. Quote, the Emergency Operations Center erupted in controlled celebration, with ground personnel acknowledging that an impossible situation had been resolved through knowledge and procedures that existed outside conventional training curricula. Dr. Rodriguez documented every aspect of the successful intervention, recognizing that Jonah's solution would need to be incorporated into official emergency procedures for future X-47 operations. Major Turner coordinated with air traffic control to establish normal approach procedures, though emergency equipment remained positioned around the runway as a precautionary measure. The X-47 systems had been restored to manageable conditions, but experimental aircraft required careful monitoring until they were safely on the ground and shut down. How did you know that procedure would work? Dr. Rodriguez asked Jonah, her scientific curiosity demanding understanding of the principles that had guided the successful intervention. The question reflected both professional interest and genuine respect for knowledge that had proven more valuable than conventional expertise during a critical emergency. Jonah's explanation revealed the depth of understanding that her father had instilled through years of informal instruction. The trim tab actuators have mechanical backup systems that can only be engaged when the aircraft is in specific flight conditions. Most pilots never encounter those conditions because normal operations don't require manual trim management. But emergency situations create exactly the circumstances where those backup systems become available. The technical explanation satisfied Dr. Rodriguez's analytical requirements while demonstrating that Jonah's knowledge extended far beyond basic maintenance procedures. Her understanding of aircraft systems integration reflected the kind of comprehensive education that took years to develop, whether through formal training programs or intensive mentorship relationships. Lieutenant Chen approached with obvious humility, his earlier skepticism replaced by genuine respect for expertise he hadn't recognized. I owe you an apology, he said simply. I made assumptions about your qualifications that were completely wrong. What you just accomplished was beyond anything I learned during flight training. The acknowledgement reflected more than personal embarrassment. It represented a recognition that aviation expertise could exist in forms that didn't match conventional expectations. Jonah's knowledge had proven more valuable during the emergency than multiple advanced degrees and official certifications, challenging assumptions about how competence should be measured and validated. Captain Brooks completed her approach with the kind of precision that characterized normal X-47 operations, the aircraft responding predictably to control inputs for the first time since the emergency began. Her landing was smooth and professional, demonstrating that the manual trim tab reset had completely resolved the controllability problems that had threatened the mission and potentially the aircraft. Excellent work from everyone involved in resolving this emergency, Brooks transmitted after the aircraft was safely parked and shut down. Especially whoever provided those manual override procedures. That solution saved both the aircraft and probably my life. I'd like to meet the person responsible for those instructions. The post-flight debriefing began immediately, with Dr. Rodriguez coordinating documentation of the emergency procedures and their successful implementation. The X-47's emergency had generated important information about aircraft behavior under extreme conditions, but it had also revealed the value of unconventional expertise during crisis situations. Captain Brooks emerged from the aircraft with the focused intensity that followed successful emergency management, but her expression carried curiosity about the source of the procedures that had resolved her crisis. She approached the group gathered around the Emergency Operations Center, clearly expecting to meet another test pilot or aerospace engineer. Captain Brooks, meet Jonah Mitchell, Major Turner said, gesturing toward the young woman who stood beside the monitoring equipment with tools still visible in her belt. She's the one who provided the manual trim tab reset procedures that restored your control authority. The introduction created a moment of cognitive dissonance that was visible on Captain Brooks' face. The maintenance worker she'd barely noticed during pre-flight preparations had somehow possessed the specialized knowledge that proved more valuable than conventional emergency procedures. The disconnect between appearance and expertise challenged assumptions that even experienced aviators occasionally made. "You're telling me the maintenance tech knew emergency procedures that we didn't?" Brooks asked, her tone carrying amazement rather than criticism. The question reflected genuine curiosity about how such expertise had been developed and why it hadn't been incorporated into standard training programs. "Her father is Colonel David Mitchell," Dr. Rodriguez explained, providing context that immediately clarified the source of Jonah's unconventional education. Apparently, she received flight instruction and aircraft systems training that most professional pilots never encounter. The revelation transformed Captain Brooks' perspective entirely. Colonel David Mitchell's reputation in experimental aviation was legendary, and his expertise in aircraft systems and emergency procedures was documented in technical publications that influenced military and civilian flight training programs worldwide. His daughter's knowledge suddenly made perfect sense within that context. "Dave Mitchell trained you personally?" Brooks asked, her voice carrying the reverence that aviators reserve for legendary figures in experimental flying. "I read his papers on emergency procedures during my own test pilot training. His work on degraded aircraft control is still considered the definitive reference in some areas." Jonah nodded, still processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. "He taught me that understanding aircraft systems was more important than just learning to operate them normally. He always said that emergencies revealed whether pilots really understood their aircraft or just knew how to follow procedures." The wisdom in that observation was apparent to everyone present, particularly in light of the morning's events. Conventional procedures had proven inadequate for the X-47 specific emergency, but deep understanding of aircraft systems had provided solutions that existed outside standard training curricula. The difference between operational knowledge and fundamental understanding had proven critical when normal procedures failed. Major Turner was already considering the implications for future test operations. "We need to incorporate these manual override procedures into our emergency checklists," he said to Dr. Rodriguez. "If similar situations develop with other aircraft, having documented procedures could prevent future emergencies from becoming disasters." Dr. Rodriguez agreed, recognizing that the morning's events had revealed gaps in standard emergency procedures that needed to be addressed through formal documentation and training programs. "We also need to consider how to identify and leverage unconventional expertise that might exist within our organization," she added, glancing toward Jonah with obvious respect. The comment carried implications that extended beyond technical procedures to fundamental questions about how organizations recognized and utilized expertise that didn't conform to conventional patterns. Jonah's knowledge had proven invaluable during the emergency, but it might have remained undiscovered if circumstances hadn't forced her to reveal capabilities that her official role didn't require or acknowledge. Lieutenant Chen had been quietly observing the interactions, his own understanding of aviation expertise being fundamentally challenged by the morning's events. "How do we know what other knowledge exists among personnel who aren't officially recognized as technical experts?" he asked, the question reflecting broader concerns about organizational effectiveness and resource utilization. The question didn't have easy answers, but it highlighted the reality that expertise often developed through pathways that didn't match institutional expectations. Aviation organizations invested heavily in formal training programs, while potentially overlooking valuable knowledge that existed in unexpected forms among personnel whose official roles didn't reflect their actual capabilities. Captain Brooks turned back to Jonah with an expression that combined professional respect with personal gratitude. "You saved my life today," she said simply. "More than that, you demonstrated knowledge that exceeded what any of us brought to this emergency. That's not something I'll forget." The acknowledgement carried weight that extended beyond personal appreciation to professional recognition of expertise that had proven itself under the most demanding circumstances possible. Jonah had transitioned from invisible maintenance worker to recognized expert in the span of a single emergency, but the transformation reflected knowledge and capabilities that had existed long before circumstances revealed them. The post-emergency analysis would continue for days, with detailed examination of both the aircraft's system failures and the procedures that had resolved them. But the immediate impact was already apparent in how the test pilot team viewed Jonah and how she was beginning to view herself. For 18 months, she had remained invisible by choice and necessity, protecting a job that provided financial stability while she completed her education. But the morning's events had demonstrated that her expertise had value that extended far beyond routine maintenance procedures, and that hiding her capabilities might actually limit her ability to contribute meaningfully to experimental aviation programs. The recognition was transformative, but it also created new challenges and opportunities that would require careful consideration. The aviation industry valued credentialed expertise, but it also respected proven performance under pressure. Jonah had demonstrated both knowledge and judgment that exceeded many officially qualified personnel, but translating that recognition into career opportunities would require navigating institutional structures that didn't always accommodate unconventional backgrounds. The emergency had ended successfully, but its implications were just beginning to unfold in ways that would affect not only Jonah's future, but also how the organization approached expertise identification and emergency preparedness in an industry where unconventional solutions sometimes proved more valuable than standard procedures. The emergency debrief lasted 3 hours, with every detail of the X-47's system failures and recovery procedures documented for future reference. But the most significant outcome wasn't technical documentation. It was the fundamental shift in how everyone involved understood the relationship between credentials and competence. Jonah sat at the conference table as an equal participant, her insights valued alongside those of pilots with decades of experience and engineers with advanced degrees. Dr. Rodriguez led the technical analysis, but she frequently deferred to Jonah's observations about aircraft system behavior and potential failure modes. Your understanding of the trim tab integration goes beyond what's documented in our technical manuals, she acknowledged during the session. We need to capture that knowledge formally and determine how it should be incorporated into our training programs. The comment reflected a broader recognition that institutional knowledge sometimes existed outside official channels, and that effective organizations needed mechanisms for identifying and preserving expertise, regardless of its source. Jonah's intervention had prevented a potential disaster, but it had also revealed gaps in standard procedures that might affect future operations. Captain Brooks remained at the facility longer than usual, participating in discussions that normally wouldn't include maintenance personnel. Her professional curiosity about the emergency procedures had evolved into genuine interest in Jonah's unconventional background and comprehensive understanding of experimental aircraft systems. I've been flying for 15 years, including 6 years as a test pilot, Brooks said during a break in the formal debriefing. But your knowledge of degraded system behavior exceeds anything I learned during official training. That suggests either a gap in our training programs or exceptional instruction from your father. The observation carried implications about both individual expertise and institutional effectiveness. Colonel David Mitchell's reputation for comprehensive instruction was well established, but the contrast between his informal training methods and official programs suggested that conventional approaches might not capture the full spectrum of knowledge required for experimental flying. Major Turner had been considering broader implications throughout the debrief, his carrier aviation background providing perspective on how organizations adapted to incorporate new knowledge and capabilities. The Navy has procedures for identifying and promoting exceptional talent regardless of conventional career paths, he mentioned. Aviation is too complex and dangerous to ignore expertise just because it doesn't fit standard patterns. The comment was directed toward Jonah, though its implications extended to organizational culture and resource management. Military aviation had learned through necessity that crisis situations often revealed capabilities that weren't apparent during routine operations, and that effective institutions needed flexibility to accommodate unconventional excellence. Lieutenant Chen had spent much of the debrief quietly reassessing his understanding of expertise and qualifications. His academic training had emphasized credentials and formal education, but the morning's events had demonstrated that practical knowledge could exceed theoretical understanding in ways that couldn't be anticipated through classroom instruction. I realize I've been thinking about aviation expertise too narrowly, he admitted during the session. My training focused on established procedures and certified knowledge, but today showed me that innovation and problem-solving might be more important than following predetermined protocols. The acknowledgement reflected intellectual honesty that was essential for continued learning in experimental aviation. Test flying demanded adaptation to situations that couldn't be anticipated through training, and success often required combining formal knowledge with intuitive understanding that developed through extensive experience with specific aircraft and systems. The formal documentation process revealed the extent of Jonah's technical knowledge. Her explanations of system interactions and failure modes demonstrated understanding that typically took years to develop through official training programs. Dr. Rodriguez found herself requesting clarification on points that would have been elementary for someone with Jonah's apparent expertise level. "Your father's instruction must have been remarkably comprehensive," Rodriguez observed while reviewing Jonah's technical descriptions. "The depth of your system's knowledge suggests exposure to information that most maintenance personnel never encounter, and understanding that exceeds many engineers' theoretical knowledge." The comment highlighted the unique nature of Jonah's education, which had combined practical maintenance experience with theoretical instruction that reflected her father's decades of experimental flying. Colonel Mitchell had apparently provided training that prepared his daughter for exactly the kind of situation that had developed during the X-47 emergency. As the debrief concluded, the conversation shifted toward future implications and potential opportunities. The successful resolution of the emergency had created precedents that would influence both technical procedures and personnel policies. But it had also identified individual capabilities that might be valuable for ongoing experimental programs. "Rockwell has been discussing expansion of our flight test division," Dr. Rodriguez mentioned, her comment directed toward Jonah but intended for the group's consideration. "We need personnel who understand both theoretical principles and practical applications, particularly for aircraft that push beyond conventional design parameters." The observation was carefully phrased, but its implications were clear. Jonah's demonstration of expertise had created opportunities that hadn't existed before the emergency, and her unique combination of knowledge and experience might prove valuable for advanced experimental programs that required unconventional problem-solving capabilities. Captain Brooks had been considering similar possibilities throughout the debrief. "The Air Force Test Pilot School has provisions for accepting candidates with non-traditional backgrounds," she mentioned, her tone suggesting genuine recommendation rather than casual observation. "Your knowledge base and demonstrated judgment under pressure would make you a strong candidate for their program." The suggestion carried implications that Jonah had barely begun to consider. Formal test pilot training would provide credentials that matched her existing knowledge, but it would also require significant time and financial investment that might not be feasible given her family's current circumstances. Major Turner had been thinking about more immediate possibilities. "The Navy's civilian contractor programs often need personnel with specialized knowledge for specific projects," he said. "Contract positions might provide better compensation while allowing flexibility for continued education or family obligations." The comment reflected understanding of the practical constraints that affected career decisions, particularly for individuals managing family responsibilities while pursuing educational goals. Military aviation had taught him that talented personnel often faced trade-offs between immediate opportunities and long-term objectives. The discussion was interrupted by a phone call that would change the trajectory of the entire conversation. Dr. Rodriguez answered her desk phone, listened briefly, then looked up with an expression that suggested important developments. "That was headquarters," she announced to the group. "Word about this morning's emergency has reached senior management, and they want a complete briefing on the procedures that resolved the crisis. They're particularly interested in the personnel involved, and how similar expertise might be identified in other programs." The organizational attention reflected recognition that the X-47 emergency had implications beyond a single incident. Experimental aviation programs involved significant investments and considerable risks, and successful emergency management could influence both technical development and safety protocols for future operations. More significantly, the senior management interests suggested that Jonah's expertise might have value that extended beyond local operations to corporate-level initiatives. Large aerospace companies constantly sought individuals who could bridge theoretical knowledge and practical application, particularly for programs that involved cutting-edge technology and unconventional challenges. "They want to meet with you specifically," Dr. Rodriguez continued, addressing Jonah directly. "Senior management is interested in understanding how your knowledge was developed and whether similar capabilities exist elsewhere in the organization." The meeting request carried implications about career opportunities that Jonah had never considered possible. Corporate attention from senior aerospace executives typically led to positions that offered both significant responsibility and compensation that could address her family's financial concerns while providing professional advancement that matched her capabilities. But the opportunities also created complex decisions about timing and priorities. Her father's condition remained a primary concern, and any career advancement would need to accommodate her family's medical and financial requirements. The mathematics of survival that had guided her decisions for 18 months suddenly included variables that could change the entire equation. Captain Brooks recognized the significance of the moment, having navigated similar transitions during her own career advancement. "These kinds of opportunities don't come often," she advised. "When organizations recognize exceptional talent, they typically provide support that addresses practical concerns like family obligations and continued education." The advice reflected understanding of how aerospace companies approached talent retention, particularly for individuals whose capabilities were difficult to replace or replicate. Jonah's combination of theoretical knowledge and practical experience represented exactly the kind of expertise that organizations valued highly and supported comprehensively. Lieutenant Chen had been observing the developing opportunities with fascination that bordered on envy. His conventional career path, through official training programs, had provided credentials and structured advancement, but Jonah's unconventional expertise was generating possibilities that exceeded anything his formal qualifications had produced. "You've demonstrated capabilities that most of us spend years trying to develop," he told Jonah as the debrief officially concluded. "Whatever opportunities develop from this, you've earned them through knowledge and performance that can't be faked or taught through standard programs." The acknowledgement reflected genuine respect for expertise that had proven itself under the most demanding circumstances possible. Emergency situations revealed both individual capabilities and organizational needs with clarity that couldn't be achieved through routine operations or formal evaluations. As the group prepared to leave the conference room, Major Turner made a final observation that captured the broader significance of the morning's events. "Today demonstrated that aviation safety and program success sometimes depend on expertise that exists outside conventional channels," he said. "Organizations that recognize and leverage that expertise gain advantages that can't be achieved through standard approaches alone." The comment summarized lessons that extended beyond individual career opportunities to fundamental questions about how institutions identified and utilized talent. Jonah's intervention had prevented a potential disaster, but it had also revealed organizational capabilities that might not have been discovered through conventional talent management approaches. Walking back toward the hangar area, Jonah reflected on the transformation that had occurred in less than 8 hours. She had begun the day as an invisible maintenance worker, concerned primarily with completing routine tasks while avoiding attention that might jeopardize her financial stability. She was ending it as a recognized expert whose knowledge had proven more valuable than multiple advanced degrees and official certifications. The change created possibilities she had never imagined, but it also demanded decisions about priorities and objectives that would affect both her future and her family's welfare. The senior management meeting would likely lead to opportunities that could resolve their financial concerns while providing professional advancement that matched her capabilities. But perhaps more importantly, the morning's events had demonstrated that expertise developed through unconventional channels could prove more valuable than formal training when circumstances demanded innovative solutions to unprecedented challenges. Her father's informal instruction had prepared her for exactly the kind of situation that had developed, validating an approach to education that prioritized understanding over credentials. The X-47 sat quietly in its hangar, its systems restored to normal operation through procedures that existed outside official manuals. The aircraft would fly again, probably within days, but its emergency had created changes that would affect both individual careers and organizational policies for years to come. Jonah's phone buzzed with a text message from her father. "How was work today?" The question carried special meaning now, given the magnitude of what had occurred. Her response would need to capture not just the day's events, but the transformation of possibilities that had emerged from 18 months of invisible competence finally being recognized by people qualified to understand its value. "Interesting," she texted back, using the same words she had planned that morning. "I'll tell you about it when I get home. I think you're going to be proud." The understatement reflected both the magnitude of the day's events and the satisfaction of knowing that her father's unconventional teaching methods had prepared her for exactly the kind of moment that defined careers in experimental aviation. The future remained unwritten, but it now included possibilities that had been unimaginable just hours earlier. Sometimes the most significant changes began with someone handing you responsibility that exceeded your official qualifications. Then stepping back, to see what you could accomplish when expertise met opportunity under circumstances that demanded excellence rather than credentials. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.